It is somewhere between 8,000 and 10,000 years ago. A human, let's call him Gerald because every catastrophic moment in history deserves a Gerald, is hungry. Gerald finds a clay pot sitting in the sun. Inside that pot is a batch of fruit that somebody left there a few days ago and completely forgot about. The fruit smells weird. It smells wrong, actually. Slightly sharp, a little sweet, a bit like something died in there and then somehow became more interesting. Gerald, who has survived his entire life by eating things that look suspicious and hoping for the best, picks up the pot and drinks it anyway. And then, approximately 30 to 45 minutes later, something happens to Gerald that has never happened to any human being in the entire history of the species. The world goes a little sideways. His legs feel strange. His face feels warm. Everything is suddenly funnier than it was before, including the rock he just walked into. He sits down, not entirely by choice. He stares at the sky. The sky seems different somehow. Better. He cannot explain why he feels this. He has no words for it. He has no framework for it. He's the first human being in history to be drunk, and he has absolutely no idea what is happening to him. What Gerald does next, and what every human society on Earth did with this discovery in the thousands of years that followed, is one of the strangest, most chaotic, most deeply human stories you've never been told.
Before we get to the humans, we need to talk about the alcohol, because alcohol didn't wait for humans to invent it. Alcohol was already here. Here's the thing most people don't realize. Fermentation is not a human invention. It is a natural process that has been happening on this planet for hundreds of millions of years. Yeast, tiny single-celled organisms that exist literally everywhere, on fruit skins, in the air, on your hands right now, consume sugar and produce two things as a byproduct: carbon dioxide and ethanol, alcohol. This means that any fruit that falls up a tree, sits on the ground long enough, and gets colonized by wild yeast will naturally ferment. It will naturally become alcoholic. No human required, no recipe needed, no clay pot even necessary. Animals figured this out long before we did. There is a species of tree shrew in Malaysia that drinks fermented palm nectar every single night as a routine part of its diet, consuming alcohol concentrations comparable to a light beer, and shows zero signs of intoxication because it has evolved specific enzymes to metabolize it almost instantly. African elephants have been documented deliberately seeking out fermented marula fruit. Whether they actually get drunk from it is a subject of genuine scientific debate, but the seeking behavior is real. They want it. They go out of their way for it. Even fruit flies show a behavioral preference to laying their eggs in fermenting fruit rather than fresh fruit because the alcohol acts as a natural defense against parasites. The fruit fly has, functionally, been making a calculated alcohol-related decision for millions of years without any awareness whatsoever that it is doing so. By the time early humans arrived on the scene, alcohol in its natural form was not some mysterious hidden substance. It was just sitting there, in fruit, in honey left in hollow trees, in grain stores that got wet and warm. It was everywhere, waiting to be discovered. The real question isn't how ancient humans found alcohol. It's what on earth they did when they did. Let's go back to Gerald. Gerald is sitting on the ground, confused and warm and inexplicably happy about a rock. What is actually happening inside his body? Ethanol, the specific type of alcohol produced by fermentation, is what chemists call a psychoactive substance, which is a polite scientific way of saying it messes with your brain. Specifically, it works primarily by enhancing the activity of GABA, an inhibitory neurotransmitter that slows down neuroactivity while simultaneously suppressing glutamates, which is the main excitatory neurotransmitter that keeps your brain running at full speed. The combined effect is a gradual dimming of the prefrontal cortex, the part of your brain responsible for judgment, consequence assessment, and the general awareness that some things are probably a bad idea. This is why alcohol makes people feel relaxed, social, and increasingly willing to make decisions they will be thinking about regretfully for years to come. Gerald's prefrontal cortex is currently running at maybe 40% capacity. Gerald is thriving. Now here's the part that nobody thinks about. Gerald is the first one. He has no reference point. He doesn't know that this is temporary. He doesn't know that it will wear off in a few hours. He doesn't know that the pounding sensation he's going going to feel in his head tomorrow morning is called a hangover, and that it is caused by acetaldehyde, a toxic byproduct of alcohol metabolism and dehydration, and his liver working overtime to process something it wasn't really designed for in large quantities. Gerald just knows that one moment the world was normal, and then he drank a weird pot of old fruit, and now things are different in a way he cannot explain and might not entirely hate. The most likely immediate reaction of everyone around Gerald, based on what anthropologists know about how early human groups responded to unexpected behavioral changes, was probably a mixture of concern, curiosity, and then, as the effects became more obvious and Gerald became increasingly philosophical about the nature of the sky, cautious interest. Because Gerald was fine. Gerald was more than fine. Gerald was great. Something in that pot made Gerald seem like the most relaxed, most talkative, most sociable version of himself. Someone else was going to want to try the pot.
Here is something that rewrites the entire story most people have in their heads about the history of alcohol. For a long time, the prevailing assumption was that alcohol was basically an accidental discovery. Early humans stumbled across fermented fruit, liked it, and eventually figured out how to make it on purpose. Alcohol as a happy accident, a pleasant side effect of agriculture and grain storage. That theory is now largely out of fashion among archaeologists, and the reason it's out of fashion is genuinely startling. The oldest confirmed evidence of intentional alcohol production dates to roughly 9,000 years ago in China. Fermented beverage made from rice, honey, and fruit, identified through chemical residue analysis on pottery shards found at a site called Jiahu. Around the same time, evidence of grape wine appears in the Zagros Mountains of what is now Iran. Beer production from barley appears in the archaeological record shortly after the earliest evidence of grain cultivation in the Fertile Crescent, which immediately raises a question that archaeologists have been arguing about for decades. Did humans start farming in order to produce food and then discover they could also make alcohol from the grain? Or did humans start farming, at least in part, in order to produce alcohol on purpose, and the food was kind of a bonus? This theory, sometimes called the beer before bread hypothesis, was first proposed seriously in the 1950s and has been gathering evidence ever since. It suggests that the desire to produce fermented beverages reliably and at scale may have been one of the driving motivations behind the development of agriculture, one of the most significant technological transitions in all of human history. Think about what that means for a second. Civilization might owe its existence, at least partially, to the fact that someone like Gerald wanted to be able to drink more weird fruit juice on purpose and not have to wait around for a tree to do it naturally. The Natufian people of the Levant, one of the early groups associated with the development of agriculture, produced large stone mortars that researchers initially assumed were used for grinding grain into flour. More recent analysis suggests at least some of them were used for brewing. Beer residue from 13,000 years ago. Göbekli Tepe, the famous ancient temple complex in Turkey that predates Stonehenge by roughly 6,000 years, contains large stone vessels that chemical analysis suggests were used to hold fermented beverage. Göbekli Tepe was built by hunter-gatherers before the development of agriculture in the region. They built a massive stone monument, and they brought alcohol to it. The first human party may have predated farming, which again raises the question of whether farming came partly because of the party. Here is something that tells you everything about human nature in one observation. Every major civilization in the ancient world, independently with no contact with each other, discovered fermented beverages. And every single one of them immediately decided it was extremely important. Not just enjoyable, important, sacred, medicinal, politically significant, cosmically meaningful. Ancient Mesopotamia, the Sumerians, had a goddess of beer. Her name was Ninkasi, and she had a dedicated hymn to her that doubled as a brewing recipe written in verse around 1800 BC. The Sumerians paid their workers partly in beer rations, daily beer, allocated by social rank. The higher your status, the better your beer. This was not a metaphor. This was the economy. Ancient Egypt ran partially on beer. Workers who built the pyramids, who were not slaves, this is a common misconception, they were paid laborers, received daily rations of beer as part of their compensation. Egyptian beer was thick, nutritious, barely alcoholic by modern standards, and consumed through straws to filter out the grain solids. Doctors prescribed it. Priests offered it to the gods. Children drank a weak version of it because the water, honestly, was often worse. In ancient China, fermented beverages made from rice and millet appear in ritual contexts going back thousands of years. Bronze vessels for serving and storing alcohol are among the most significant archaeological artifacts from the Shang dynasty. Alcohol wasn't just consumed. It was poured out as an offering to ancestors in elaborate ceremonies that took the whole thing very, very seriously. The ancient Greeks had Dionysus, the god of wine, festivals, ecstasy, and theatrical chaos. His worship was one of the most widespread religious movements in the ancient world. The Dionysian festivals, held annually, involved drinking, music, drama, and what ancient sources describe as a general collapse of normal social boundaries, which is a very academic way of saying things got very weird and nobody minded. The Romans inherited wine culture from the Greeks, expanded it aggressively across their empire, and eventually produced a wine consumption culture so embedded in daily life that even children, soldiers, and slaves received wine rations as a standard part of existence. Roman soldiers on campaign carried a sour wine called pasca, mixed with water as their primary hydration strategy. In the Americas, the Aztecs had pulque, a fermented beverage made from agave sap. The Inca had chicha, a fermented corn drink that was central to religious ceremony, political alliance, and daily nutrition. Indigenous peoples across North America developed their own fermented beverages independently, from fermented cactus in the Southwest to various fruit and berry wines across the continent. These civilizations had no contact with each other. They developed alcohol production independently. They all arrived at roughly the same conclusion, which is that fermented beverages were medically useful, religiously significant, economically valuable, socially essential, and extremely worth going to considerable trouble to produce reliably and at scale. The global human consensus on alcohol, reached independently by every major civilization in history, was essentially, yes, more of this please, and also we should probably involve the gods somehow. Fermented beverages were often safer to drink than untreated water, especially once humans started living in dense, settled communities where water sources were frequently contaminated. The fermentation process kills a lot of pathogens. The mild acidity of wine and beer made them genuinely safer options in environments where drinking the river was a legitimate health gamble. Drinking beer in ancient Mesopotamia wasn't just a recreational choice. In many contexts, it was the sensible medical decision. But that's not the whole answer. They assigned it cosmic significance that went far beyond the practical. And the reason for that, researchers now believe, has to do with something very specific about what alcohol does socially. Alcohol, in moderate amounts, reduces social anxiety. It lowers the psychological barriers between individuals. It makes people more willing to talk to strangers, to share, to cooperate, to trust. In the context of early human societies, small groups constantly navigating complex social hierarchies, alliances, conflicts, and negotiations, a substance that reliably made social bonding easier would have had genuine survival value. The anthropologist Robin Dunbar, who is probably most famous for the concept of Dunbar's number, the idea that humans can maintain stable social relationships with roughly 150 people, has studied the social role of alcohol extensively and argues that its primary evolutionary function in human society has been as a social bonding agent. Shared drinking, in his view, is essentially a tool for building and maintaining the social connections that human survival depends on, which would explain why almost every ancient civilization embedded alcohol into its most important social rituals. Not because the priests discovered fermentation and decided it was sacred, but because the social function of shared drinking, the trust building, the barrier lowering, the communal vulnerability of being in an altered state together, genuinely served the kinds of social needs that were life or death important in early human communities. Gerald didn't just drink something weird and feel strange. Gerald, whether he knew it or not, stumbled onto one of the most powerful social technologies in human history. So, why do you talk to yourself? Because your brain learned to think in words when you were 3 years old, and sometimes it still needs to hear those words out loud to function at full capacity. Because verbal self-instruction improves focus, memory, and performance in ways silent thought cannot always match. Because the third-person pep talk activates a more rational version of your decision-making. Because processing experiences verbally helps your brain categorize emotions that would otherwise pile up. Because for some people, the inner voice needs external help to function properly. And because for most of you, step and address the instruction manual directly, also completely normal, though the instruction manual genuinely cannot hear you, probably. Next time someone catches you talking to yourself and gives you a look, feel free to explain that you are engaging in externalized verbal cognitive processing, practiced by Roman emperors, elite athletes, surgeons, astronauts, and LeBron James. Or just say you were talking to the granola. Either works.